Medical assistance in dying, or MAID, has been legal in Canada since 2016. What started as a way to hasten the end of life for people facing death because of terminal illness has now been expanded. People living with disabilities or chronic illness are now eligible for medical assistance in dying as well. Advocates argue MAID is a way to die with dignity, to end the suffering they can't escape.
No one chooses death lightly. We just don't want to suffer anymore.
Most recently, an Ontario woman who suffers from multiple chemical sensitivities made the news. After failed efforts to find wheelchair-accessible housing that is free from scents that could trigger her disorder, she has sought approval to access medical assistance in dying. An Anglican parish priest called on his congregation for support.
She wants to live. It was easier for her to get the approval for medical assistance in dying than it was to get a change in her housing. Disability and poverty should not be a death sentence. The second is that the government should be more willing to help someone live than to die. And the third is that Denise is made in the image of God and bears infinite dignity, just as do all of you, just as does everyone in the city and on this earth, and we want her to live.
Denise is not the first person to access MAID due to lack of support for her disability. Next year, the law will permit MAID for those with mental illness as a sole eligibility criteria.
It was always the case that mental illness was going to be considered.
You do have people who are suicidal, who get MAID, who would have actually gotten better.
What message does this send to those seeking to live but unable to access care and services, looking for a way out?
Every year, Canadians come together in this really deliberate way to say to those who are struggling with their mental health, hey, you matter. You are loved, you're valued, you're seen, and our families, our communities are better off with you in them. The very same time this was happening, there was a conversation going on in the government about that in a few years' time, we would expand access to medical assistance in dying to people who are struggling from mental illness alone. And that sends a really different message.
As someone who struggles with mental illness, I don't need someone to tell me how to die. I need someone to tell me to stay.
Where do we draw the line for medical assistance in dying? This week on Context, facing death. Have we lost the value of life? Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. As you just saw, changes to medical assistance in dying legislation come into effect next March, adding mental illness as a qualifier in seeking assisted death. Jocelyn Downey is a research professor in the faculties of law and medicine at Dalhousie University, and she was a special advisor to the Canadian Senate Committee on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide. She joins me now. Thanks for joining me today, Jocelyn. An expert panel is looking at how to implement MAID, where mental illness is the sole condition. This isn't as black and white as terminal illness, like Track 1 patients. What needs to be considered in the policy as this is being looked at?
There are complexities with respect to some mental illnesses, but not all mental illnesses and not only mental illnesses. So we need to pay attention to things like complexities with respect to how do we tell if the condition is incurable? How do we tell if the person's suffering is, in fact, irremediable? Those are challenging, and we need procedural safeguards and guidance for clinicians to ensure that they are doing those kinds of assessments well. People also raise concerns about vulnerabilities, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, because we do know that people with disabilities and people with mental disorders, many of them do not have adequate supports and services. So the question is, what's the impact of that on an assessment for MAID and on access to MAID?
Well, that leads perfectly into my next question, Jocelyn. Our country and society have really been trying to break down the stigma of mental health, normalizing getting help and calling for expanded services. What message does allowing assisted dying for mental illness send?
I think that it actually is entirely consistent with that message because it prevents the stigmatizing and paternalistic messaging which comes with exclusion. Because exclusion says to people with mental illness, you aren't capable of making a decision for yourself. We need to protect you from yourself. And I think that's stigmatizing and paternalistic. I think we also need to be messaging to people the same consistent message, which is people who have mental illness absolutely are of no less value than anybody else in society. But that's consistent with saying, but if you, with all the supports and services that we can provide, if you still want MAID, then we're going to respect your autonomy.
Okay, so let's clarify that. So when someone is applying for MAID, especially next year, come the mental illness provision, is there an avenue of making sure that that person has accessed all of the services that they could possibly have before they are able to be qualified for MAID?
If assuming they're track 2, so they don't have a physical condition that makes that's reasonably foreseeable, they have to go through an assessment process which is more demanding, and it does include that there must be a consultation with somebody who has expertise in the person's condition, if neither of the assessors have that. And also all available alternatives to MAID need to be presented to the person, and that's what gets explored with individuals in particular who show up with a mental disorder or disability, is to say, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Let's explore the different things that are available, and are you willing to try them rather than proceeding immediately to MAID? So there are these safeguards already built in with respect to supports and services. That isn't to say that everything that could possibly help has to be available, because we as a society quite simply can't do that. We don't do that for any health services and supports and services. So that's the challenging situation we're in, that there may be something that's available in another country, for instance, and we as a society can't provide that. But what we're saying is we need to make available everything. We need to make known to the person everything that could be available to them and provide them with the opportunity to try that which they're willing to try.
All right, a complex issue. Thank you so much, Jocelyn Downey, for your time today.
My pleasure.
Some physicians are voicing their concerns over the inclusion of mental illness as a qualification for MAID. Family physician Dr. Farouk Faruqi works closely with patients struggling with mental health issues and joins me now. Dr. Faruqi, what are your main concerns about allowing those with mental illness the opportunity to die by medical-assisted dying?
Well, I think the very first thing that jumps out is the whole MAID framework is based on irremediability, which means that, you have to be in a situation where the prognosis for a particular patient is pretty much hopeless. Now, in terms of mental illness, that's problematic because psychiatry, unfortunately, is not at the stage where other disciplines are, where the other specialties are. So, for example, heart failure, multiple sclerosis, for example, there's a lot of research done on these very common conditions. And we can, with, a fair degree of confidence say, in this particular situation, the prognosis here is poor. This person will not get better. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for mental illness. So then you have the situation where a patient asks for MAID and will never, and if that person is accepted for MAID, we'll never know if that person could have gotten better.
Dr. Faruqi, what would you say to those suffering from prolonged mental illness that would like to explore this option come next year when it is legal?
I mean, the first thing I would do is offer my wholehearted compassion, because people with mental illness are suffering, absolutely. So first of all, to recognize that they are in fact suffering. But the answer to suffering is not to say, sorry, we can't help you, but we can offer MAID instead, because that's what's happening now. If I said to a person with cancer, I'm sorry, I can't help you, but we can offer MAID instead, I think a lot of people would be up in arms and outraged. But that's what we're essentially saying to people with mental illness, because it's not available. And the government, there was supposed to be a review in June 2020 of mental illness and palliative care and so on after MAID was first legalized. That review never happened.
You said that patient autonomy is the driving force as opposed to alleviation of suffering when it comes to MAID and mental health. Is there a greater conversation that needs to be had here?
I think so. Personal autonomy is not a negative thing. It's a good thing. We all want personal autonomy, but like so many other things, there has to be a point at which we say, what does personal autonomy like? Is there such a thing as too much personal autonomy? And does your personal autonomy then infringe on somebody else's rights? And I talk in my piece about the people who've had a good life, who are mostly privileged, mostly upper class, mostly affluent, mostly white. People are choosing to have what they call good deaths, and they have lobbied very hard for this right. What they fail to see, and what they're continue to fail to see and to address, is that their rights come at the expense of the rights of other people who are vulnerable, who've never had a shot at a good life, who are marginalized by poverty, by illness, by trauma. None of these people have had a shot at a good life. And we're seeing this. More and more news reports are coming out of people choosing MAID because they can't get the social supports they need, they can't get the medical supports they need, they can't get psychiatric care. So personal autonomy is great in theory, but it's causing a lot of harm to a lot of people.
Dr. Faruqi, before we leave, we did have someone on just prior to you who is in support of MAID, especially this new provision of mental illness. And Jocelyn Downey had said, Professor Jocelyn Downey had said that the mental illness caveat would come after all of the services have been explored by the person that has applied for MAID. And so, let's say someone who's struggling with their mental illness applies next year for MAID, that the caregiver, the medical caregiver, would make sure that all services were looked at, were explored before MAID becomes the last resort, the last option. Is that how you understand this new provision and how it would function?
That may be the intent in theory. In practice, that's not what's happening. There's another case that just came out in BC of a woman who opted for MAID, and she, the daughters have gone to the RCMP and are asking for charges to be laid in that case. Theory and practice are very difficult things. And, the people who believe that MAID is a good thing, I think their intentions are very good. They want to see people relieved from their suffering. But what happens instead is that, that particular individual, she didn't get the help that she needed. She never got the specialized psychiatric care that she needed. We know that, only 30% of people who need specialized psychiatric care get it because there just aren't enough psychiatrists. The run-of-the-mill things we as family doctors can manage. But again, family doctors are also, we're besieged by all kinds of things. So in theory, it sounds good. In practice, it doesn't happen. People don't get the care and the assessment and the treatment that they need. A serious psychiatric illness such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, these aren't things that you cure with a simple antibiotic and things get better. It requires sometimes years of therapy, our medication, community supports, all kinds of things. And these resources simply aren't available. So in the end, when you say that, people with psychiatric illness are suffering, absolutely they are, but they're not getting the resources that they need. And we are really not investing in those resources. So in practice, I would say that, I don't think that's what's happening. Yeah. And I think it's going to happen more and more.
All right. Dr. Faruqi, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, the Q panel discusses mental health and medical assistance in dying. Have we gone too far? We will discuss.
Society tells us we should live for today, but have we considered what lies ahead tomorrow? God promises that He has a plan for you, a plan to give you hope and a future. If you're anxious about what tomorrow holds, call our 24/7 prayer lines at 1-866-273-4444 or visit crossroads.ca/247prayer. Anytime, anywhere, we're here for you.
Leah MILOUSIS is a mental health survivor and has some concerns about including mental illness as a reason for qualifying for medical assistance in dying. Thanks for joining us today, Leah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So you've struggled with your mental health, yet you say this new provision has gone too far. Why?
For me, this issue was academic for a very long time, but once I started understanding and piecing together the fact that, many people are pursuing medical assistance in dying because they're trying to escape suffering. And that's really what my experience was as someone who did attempt suicide a number of times. I started really becoming concerned about the message that it sends when we start saying that death is the solution to this kind of suffering.
Advocates for the expansion of MAID to include mental illness say we should treat it the same way we treat physical illness. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I do understand in the context of, my suffering as someone who is suffering psychologically from a mental illness is no less painful for me than the suffering experienced by an individual who is suffering from a physical condition or a terminal condition. But I think for me, the big point is that just like I shouldn't be, my suicide should not have been assisted, the suicide of individuals who are experiencing other suffering should not be assisted. And it's not because our suffering is different or less important or less painful to us. There's not really a differentiation there. It's really because, like I said, I cling to the belief that in the context of suffering, suicide is not the answer. Death is not the solution. And I think that is a really important line that I worry we've crossed. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't draw lines and draw distinctions and say it's for some people but not others. I just worry that those will, to some extent, always be arbitrary. And so I really hope that we as a society can get back to a place where we say death is not the solution, suicide is not the solution to suffering, and that, individuals do not have the ability to end the lives of other people, even if they're trained healthcare providers.
You talk a lot about support, Leah, and I want to understand that a little bit more, in the sense that if mental illness becomes one of these provisions, what kind of support do you think the government needs to provide, especially in the realm of mental illness, if someone is looking at options of medical assistance in death?
I think in my context, what was really integral to my recovery was community. And what was really integral was my faith. That community message, what we send, the message we send to people who are struggling with mental health is crucial. Really, the question is, how can we say that we're being equal and, in supporting individuals and providing them with, equitable access to healthcare when we're not providing them with assistance in living, but only with assistance in dying in some contexts.
So what would you say to people who are struggling with their mental health, struggle with mental illness, and might, in a year when this provision is allowed, might be compelled to apply for medical assistance in death?
I do know from experience that there aren't any magic words. There's nothing perfect that you can say to someone in that position. But I think what I would really want to say is, I might not know your story and I might not understand exactly what it's like to go through what you're going through, but I want to understand and I want to know your story. I want to know about the highs and the lows, the triumphs and the tragedies, and I want to communicate, and I hope you believe me when I say that it will be in those unplanned, unsurprising, unplanned, unintentional moments that you realize that, there is joy to life, that despite all the suffering that life brings at times, and I do understand that from experience, that life really does get better.
Leah, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. Take care.
All right, the Q panel is here, Colin, Jackie, and Calvin. So by 2023, the Government of Canada intends to add mental health to the list of eligible requirements in seeking medical assistance in dying. We heard from one woman today who has a history of mental illness, and she says more money needs to be put into resources, not an easier way to end your life. Thoughts? Colin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that particular sentiment. The big reservation I have about extending medical assistance in dying to mental illnesses actually does surround this exact issue. This is it sounds crass to say, but a relatively inexpensive way to address a very serious societal problem, when we really should be putting significant resources instead into increasing quality of life, into making life not just livable, but an opportunity for flourishing for people who are living with various kinds of mental and physical disabilities.
Jackie, what are your thoughts?
I think that this is something all Canadians should be concerned about. We are looking at potentially opening the door for additional reasons of how people can access physician-assisted suicide. In particular, one of the things that concerns me, aside from allowing those who are mentally ill to be able to step forward and make this decision, is those who are minors to be able to make this decision. I understand that's something that's also before the courts, and this is something that is extremely concerning. There are several other countries that do allow this, and I think it's something that Canadians need to keep our eye on. I unfortunately am not actually seeing much dialogue about this, and in just anecdotal conversations with people, I'm noticing that there's actually been quite a concern, and people don't seem to know this is something that can potentially happen in our country. So I'd like to see more discussion around this, because it certainly will impact everyone, not only the individual who may be able to consent to this, but their family. And there's some really concerning cases right now that are being investigated about whether individuals who potentially consented really were able to be in a position to do so.
Yeah. Calvin, does our society value life?
I think we do, in a very selfish and self-absorbed way. We've subscribed to individualism, right? And so we've over-celebrated this personal identity that we have. And I think part of that has shown that we don't actually have to be responsible or accountable for the people that we are in relationship or in proximity to. And so I think that there's a huge gap between us actually saying we value life and then the actual effort that we make towards valuing life itself.
Do we send mixed messages when we tell people to seek help if they're struggling with their mental health, and yet we provide the option, like this one that might be provided, looks like it will be come next year? Colin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we have been prioritizing mental health over the last number of years. We've had lots of public campaigns. We've had an attempt to raise awareness about mental health in our society, all of which I think has been excellent. I think these are really great things we're working to do. And a big part of this is seeing our neighbor as our neighbor, even when they are struggling with some kind of significant mental health issue or even mental health disability, a long-term disability. And so to turn around and to say, this issue that you're struggling with that may in fact have solutions, or that may in fact have some kind of remediation, that these things are not worth pursuing, and that we are going to give you an option to end your life instead. It really does feel like sending mixed messages. It feels like we're moving backwards and not forwards in the very important conversation about mental health and mental disability and the place of people who suffer from mental health issues in our society.
So Jackie, where does the church fit into this conversation?
That is a tricky one. I think the church, as with any organization that is concerned about ethics and morals, need to really look at what this means for our society. The church is an interest group, just like any other organization, that can either be for or against these proposed changes. I think that the church's role is to let individuals know that they are loved, that they are valued, of course. But having said that, there are illnesses, there are situations that are so extreme. And really, that is what we are talking about. We are not talking about making this accessible or commonplace for the average individual. We are looking at the most extreme cases. Even that is controversial in itself, but just a reminder that, simply letting individuals know that they are loved and cared for is not enough. And we also have to show that through our actions rather than simply with empty words, which often, sometimes, unfortunately, the church does.
Calvin, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the church needs to be reminded that there are some things that Jesus said are only broken through prayer and fasting, and that's not to abdicate responsibility. But I think as a church, we need to start preparing ourselves and allocating resources as well as praying and fasting, to give a considerable amount of care to families who are going to be working this out in real time. Being available to pray, being available to serve, I think will be the greatest answer, not picketing, but praying, fasting, serving. I think that's going to be the most reasonable response to see how we can get through this next phase as a nation together.
All right, we're going to call it there. Colin, Jackie, and Calvin, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you.
One of my favorite movies is called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It's the story of Fred Rogers, played by Tom Hanks. Spoiler alert, near the end of the movie, one of the characters is on their deathbed, and everyone is talking about everything else except the elephant in the room, death. And then Mr. Rogers says, to die is to be human, and anything human is mentionable. Anything mentionable is manageable. I'm not here to pick a side when it comes to medical assistance in dying. That is a personal journey each individual must choose. But I will say this. As someone who has struggled with postpartum depression in the past, hearing someone say you are worth it, you are loved, you are cared for, brought me out of my depression and showed me hope. I wasn't a burden, I was a blessing, and I needed to hear that in my deepest time of despair. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 in the Bible says, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Psalm 139 says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." And later on goes to say, "If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." He is with you, and he sees your pain, and he has promised to be with you through every step of the way. Thank you for watching. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.